Anantahan Island Incident. 32 men and 1 woman in a 6-year island dilemma. Anantahan Island is located about 177 kilometers north of Saipan Island and is an oval island in the Mariana Islands in the Pacific Ocean. The island is small, about 9 kilometers long, 3.7 kilometers wide, with a total area of 31.21 square kilometers. And there is a volcano at an altitude of 790 meters. And there are also large coconut groves. Coconut plantations here were once very developed, but later gradually declined due to typhoon destruction, and only more than 20 indigenous people were left to work here at the time of the incident. During World War II, this humble island became the stage of a human tragedy. 32 Japanese men and 1 Japanese woman were trapped here for 6 years, and a series of absurd scrambles and deaths were staged one after another around 2 pistols symbolizing power and the only woman on the island. And finally, the women survived, leaving only 19 of the 32 men. Behind this island dilemma, there is a naked revelation of human nature in extreme environments. The story starts in 1939. At that time, Japan pursued an overseas colonial policy to encourage its citizens to immigrate to the Pacific islands it occupied, and 16-year-old Kazuko Higa was one of them. She set off from her hometown of Okinawa and arrived in Saipan after a long journey, with the original intention of taking refuge in her brother who lived there. After arriving in Saipan, Kazuko quickly found a job as a coffee shop waiter, and she attracted many suitors as a young and beautiful woman, one of whom was her fellow townsman from Okinawa, Shoichi Higa. After the two fell in love for a while, they officially got married when Kazuko was 18 years old, and their married life was peaceful and happy for a while. Shoichi Higa's occupation was closely related to Japan's colonial plans, and he worked for Japan Nanyang Shinfa Co., Ltd., where his main job was to supervise the work of indigenous laborers on the occupied islands. In 1944, Shoichi was sent to Anantahan Island due to a work transfer, and Kazuko chose to go with her husband, accompanied by Shoichi's boss, Nakazato. After arriving on Anantahan Island, the main task of the three was to manage the island's only more than 20 indigenous people, and no one thought that this small island would become their prison cage in the future. At that time, World War II was coming to an end. Japan was retreating in the Pacific Theater, and many islands originally occupied were recaptured by the US military one after another. Shenji learned that his sister was still on a nearby island and was worried about her safety, so he temporarily left the island to visit, but he completely lost contact and never returned to Anantahan Island. At this point, there were only 2 Japanese on the island, Kazuko and Nakazato. In the difficult environment of isolation, the two fell in love for a long time, and finally lived together in the name of husband and wife, temporarily living a stable life for the two. The good times did not last long, and Anantahan Island was soon drawn into the war. The US military launched a bombing of the island, and Kazuko and Nakazato managed to survive by hiding in the dense forest in the center of the island. But after the bombing, the island's plantations were reduced to ruins, the reserves of daily necessities were almost burned, and communication with the outside world was completely interrupted, and Anantahan Island was completely reduced to an isolated island. Fortunately, the 40 pigs and 20 chickens they had raised escaped the bombing, and these livestock became important supplies for the two to survive, and they carefully cared for them and barely made ends meet. However, the calm in the world of the two did not last long. On June 12, 1944, 4 Japanese spy fishing boats were attacked by the US military in the waters near Anantahan Island. 3 fishing boats sank on the spot, and the other was severely damaged and sank to the bottom of the sea shortly after. The attack killed many crew members, but fortunately, some of the survivors swam to the shore with all their might because they were not far from the island. And finally 31 men managed to land on the island. Among these, 31 were 10 Japanese Navy soldiers and 21 ordinary crew members, all young men, the youngest of whom was only 16 years old. Due to the destruction of the ship, They lost the possibility of leaving and could only temporarily stay on the island to survive. At first, the 31 survivors thought Anantahan Island was an uninhabited island and barely survived on the island's wild bananas, coconuts, and coconut crabs. Until one time when picking wild fruits, they met Kazuko and Nakazai, who were also looking for food. Seeing their fellow villagers, both sides were very surprised. In addition to them, there were only natives who did not understand the language on the island, and communication was difficult. Kazuko and Nakazato warmly received these survivors, not only sharing their own food, but also helping the injured heal. Initially, the 31 survivors were divided into several small groups to live, but after getting acquainted with each other, they gathered together with Kazuko and Nakazato to live together, and the 33 people formed a temporary island community. After the population increases, the first problem is food and clothing. The pigs and chickens on the island were quickly eaten, but fortunately, the island's resources were acceptable, and everyone relied on wild fruits, coconut, crabs and fish caught on the beach to satisfy their hunger. When their clothes were damaged, they made rudimentary clothing out of tree bark. In his spare time, he also learned to make wine with coconut fruit and coconut tree pulp. In this way, the 33 people lived peacefully on the isolated island for more than a year, until Japan announced its unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. The people on the island know nothing about it. The US military had conveyed the news of surrender to the island through airdrop leaflets, but these Japanese firmly believed that this was a conspiracy of the US military and resolutely refused to leave the island. The natives on the island have already left one after another, and finally only these 33 Japanese are left on Anantahan Island, continuing to live in isolation. With the temporary solution of the problem of food and clothing, the human weakness of food and clothing began to appear. The extremely unbalanced ratio of men and women on the island, 32 men and 1 woman, gradually became strange, and the air began to be filled with an uneasy atmosphere. Some thoughtful and well-intentioned people sensed the danger and proposed that Kazuko and Nakazato hold a formal wedding in front of everyone to clarify Kazuko's belonging to dispel other people's thoughts. After the wedding, Kazuko and Nakazato moved away from the crowd to live alone, which temporarily worked, easing tensions on the island and returning to peace. But no one expected that a bigger crisis was quietly brewing. In August 1946, the wreckage of a crashed US bomber was found on the island, which contained not only a parachute that could be made into clothing, but also 4 damaged pistols and 90 rounds of ammunition. There were people on the island who were soldiers and were very familiar with the structure of firearms, and finally succeeded in repairing 2 of them. The emergence of these 2 guns completely broke the fragile balance on the island. On an island without rules, guns are symbols of power, and those who hold guns have the capital to dictate, and the fate of 33 people has been completely rewritten. The 2 people who repaired the guns were Yamamoto and Yamaguchi, and after they got the guns, they immediately claimed to be rulers, and their primary target was the only woman on the island, Kazuko. The 2 coerced Kazuko and Nakazato with guns, and finally forced Kazuko to live with them, forming a deformed relationship of 3 men and 1 woman. Soon after, the first bizarre death occurred on the island. A man who had conflicts with Yamamoto and Yamaguchi fell to his death from a coconut tree, and there were only 2 witnesses at the scene, Yamamoto and Yamaguchi. This matter made others suspicious, but because of the fear of guns, no one dared to question it. After that, Yamamoto and Yamaguchi became even more arrogant, and a man who tried to get close to Kazuko was even shot directly by them. Fear began to spread on the island, and everyone's attention shifted from fighting for Kazuko to self-preservation, and Nakazato knew that he was in danger, so he took the initiative to withdraw from Yamamoto and Yamaguchi, saying that he would no longer participate in the competition for Kazuko. Nakazato's concession is not cowardice, but sees a key point. Yamamoto and Yamaguchi previously formed an alliance because of common interests fighting for power and Kazuko, but now that the foundation of the alliance has disappeared, the two will inevitably have conflicts over the struggle for Kazuko, and eventually turn against each other. The development of things was as expected in Nakazato. It didn't take long for Yamamoto and Yamaguchi to break out in a fierce conflict over the right to belong to Kazuko, and finally Yamaguchi won and Yamamoto died. Yamaguchi not only occupied Kazuko alone, but also controlled 2 guns, becoming the only overlord on the island. But he didn't get proud for long, and soon after he was found to have fallen into the sea and drowned. Everyone understood the true cause of his death, but no one pointed it out, just secretly accumulating strength and waiting for the opportunity to overthrow the hegemon. After Yamaguchi's death, the 2 guns fell into the hands of Nakazawa and Rishi, and history repeated itself. The 2 immediately occupied Kazuko with guns, forming a new core of power. But this balance is also fragile, and more than a month later, Nakazawa and Itsushi clashed over the distribution of power and the ownership of Kazuko, and Yoshiki finally won, holding the gun alone, rigorously learned the lessons of the previous overlords, acted cautiously on weekdays, and was always wary of others. Relying on this vigilance, he spent 2 years safely, but even so, he still failed to escape the fate of being assassinated in the end. And no one knew who the murderer was, and no one held him accountable. In the following years, the haze of death hung over Anantahan Island, and 3 more men died on the grounds of accident, bringing the cumulative death toll to 9. The survivors finally realized that guns were the root of all tragedies and gathered for a meeting. After discussion, everyone reached a consensus. Let Kazuko choose one of the surviving men to officially marry, and at the same time, throw 2 guns into the sea to completely eliminate the symbol of power. After the implementation of the plan, the island briefly regained calm, but the good times did not last long, and 4 more men mysteriously died or disappeared. At this time, there were no guns, and the root of the conflict obviously did not disappear. The survivors met again, this time pointing the finger at Kazuko, believing that lust for Kazuko was the root cause of the killing, and finally decided absurdly, only by getting rid of Kazuko could the chaos on the island end completely, and they planned to do it the next day. Fortunately, a man who loved Kazuko deeply couldn't bear to watch her die, and secretly informed Kazuko of the news. Kazuko was terrified when she learned about it, and fled into the dense forest deep in the island overnight, hiding in the dense forest with her familiarity with the island and her strong desire to survive. In June 1950, after 33 days of fleeing in the dense forest, Kazuko accidentally discovered a US warship moored on the beach. She immediately climbed a nearby tree, took off her parachute clothes, waved desperately, and shouted for help. The US military found her, and Kazuko was finally rescued, ending her 6-year life on an isolated island. After being rescued, Kazuko told the US military about the situation on the island, and the US military immediately sent people to Anantahan Island to inform the remaining Japanese that the war was over, but these people still didn't believe it, insisting that it was a conspiracy of the US military, and refused to leave the island. After Kazuko returned to Japan, she immediately contacted the families of the survivors on the island and informed them that their relatives were still alive. The families of the survivors wrote letters about the end of the war and begged them to go home. The US military airdropped more than 200 letters to the island, but the people on the island still stubbornly believed that this was a trap and were unwilling to leave. It was not until June 26, 1951, when a man recognized that the handmade marks in the letter were unique to his wife, that he finally believed that the war was indeed over, and he then convinced others. At this point, the remaining 19 men on the island let down their guard, surrendered to the US military, were sent to the US military base in Guam, and then returned to Japan. After these people returned to China, it caused a lot of shock because they had been missing for many years. Their families and society thought they had long died in the war, and many of their wives had remarried, and Kazuko's husband, Shoichi Higa, was no exception. When the media asked about the whereabouts of the 13 dead, the survivors had different accounts and were full of loopholes. And finally, under the pressure of public opinion, some people told the real situation on the island. After the story of Anantahan Island was reported by the media, it immediately became the focus of attention in Japan, and Kazuko was pushed to the forefront. The media labeled her as Queen of Anantahan Island, Woman with 32 Men, Queen Bee, Woman who charms men, and other labels, and most media belittled and condemned her, believing that she was the scourge that caused the killing, and only a few media sympathized with her, believing that she had no choice under power and violence, and could only compromise. Since then, Kazuko's life has been closely tied to the Anantahan Island incident. In 1952, she was invited to star in the stage play Anantahan Island, and toured the country for 2 years. In 1953, the incident was adapted into the movie The Truth About Anantahan Island, in which Kazuko herself starred herself and recreated the experience on the isolated island. But her acting career did not bring her long-term stability, and a few years later, she was unable to continue her acting career due to the decline in popularity, and in order to make a living, she worked as a dancer in Tokyo. At the age of 34, Kazuko met a new partner, and after the two got married, they opened a small shop and lived an ordinary life. But happiness was still short-lived, and when she was in her 40s, her husband died, and she was alone again. In March 1974, Kazuko died of a brain tumor at the age of about 50, ending a life full of twists and turns and controversies. Although the Anantahan incident is only a local tragedy that occurred on an isolated island, it is like a mirror reflecting the general dilemma of human society. When morality loses the constraints of rules, when the cloak of civilization is torn apart by the pressure of survival, the law of the jungle will dominate, and the boundaries between human nature and animality will become blurred. Some people believe that the two guns and the only woman are the root of the tragedy, but in fact, the gun is just the fuse, and the child is only a catalyst, and the real root is the uncontrollable desire of human beings, the desire for power, the possessiveness of the opposite sex, and the selfishness and cruelty exposed in extreme environments. As the weak person in the incident, Kazuko has always been in a passive position, and her compromise and obedience are not charming, but the survival instinct under power, which deserves sympathy. And this tragedy confirms the importance of institutions, rules and laws. They are not only a barrier to protect the vulnerable, but also the key to maintaining social balance and restraining human desires. Without the constraints of the rules, even without guns and children, human desires will eventually lead to conflict in other ways, which is the most profound warning left by the Anantahan Island incident to the world. Full text is 2,586 words in total. Concise description. This adjustment supplements the detailed description of key plots such as the life of the survivors after landing on the island. The specific process of the change of power restores the streamlined logical connection content in the original text, while retaining all the core facts and event context, and supplementing the number of words to the required range under the premise of strictly following the structure and style of the original text to ensure that the information is complete and free of redundancy.